So the year is 1966. Only some of us were around then. An 11-year-old African-American boy moves with his parents and his family to an all-white neighborhood in Washington, D.C. He wonders what would happen. His parents had sheltered him as much as they could, but he'd heard frightening stories about what happened when black people crossed the color line. One morning, shortly after the family had moved in, he sat with his two brothers on the front porch. People walked by on the sidewalk. They looked directly at them. Nobody smiled. No one said hello. Confirmed all the stories he had heard. Years later, he wrote, "I knew we would not be welcome. I knew we would not be liked. I knew we would have no friends here." But then, a white woman walking home from work on the sidewalk across the street did the most amazing thing. She smiled. She said, "Welcome." She went in her house, came back a few minutes later with a tray of cream cheese and jelly sandwiches, some cold drinks. She brought them and offered them to the anxious, frightened children sitting on the porch steps. That moment changed his life at a critically tense moment in his own formation, in a year that was a pivotal year for race relations in the U.S., a difficult year. A simple gesture showed him that a black family could feel at home in this new place. Relationships across the wide gulf of race were possible. Changed his life. That boy's name is Stephen Carter. He's a professor now at Yale. About 10 years ago, he wrote a book called Civility. He tells the story in it, and he concludes thinking about how angry people are with one another, how rude people are with one another, all of that. Concludes that religious faith can be part of the solution. You see, the woman's name was Sarah Kastenbaum. She was, Carter says, a religious Jew who was simply doing what her faith told her to do. To this day, I can close my eyes and feel on my tongue the smooth sweetness of the cream cheese and jelly sandwiches. On that summer afternoon, when I learned how a single act of genuine and unassuming civility can change a life forever. Those cream cheese and jelly sandwiches for him were what happened to a woman a long time before on another hot day. They were living water. The earliest followers of Jesus, his first disciples, they were all Jews. They initially thought, this deal is a Jewish deal. And then things started to change. Gentiles started to show interest. Roman centurion here, Greek merchant there, a Syrian, an Egyptian. A man by the name of Paul really started to stir things up in the first century. It was a crisis. How in the world do you invite in a stranger and alien, an outsider? And the issue emerges in an incident in Jesus' ministry. The first hint of trouble is the way the story begins. Jesus and his disciples have left Jerusalem. They're traveling north to Galilee, and they have to go through Samaria. I've been to Israel a couple of times. When I went 30 years ago, our bus driver was Jewish. And when we were going to go through, he cut around a different way, said, this is 2,000 years later, I'm not going through Samaria. I don't like those people. This is 1986. 700 years before Jesus, the Assyrians conquered, occupied Samaria. And instead of leaving everybody in their own places, they imported all kinds of people. They brought in different nationalities, different races, different religions. Samaria to the people of Jerusalem looked like a hodgepodge, an ethnic hodgepodge, sort of like Toronto. And to make things worse, they were arguing over where was the place you ought to worship God. Some argued Jerusalem, some in Samaria argued, no, we have the highest mountain. Our mountain's better than your mountain. Our church is better than your church, etc. And over 700 years that had festered so that the two groups of people, even though they were cousins, they wouldn't talk to one another, wouldn't touch one another, wouldn't eat or drink. Hence the irony of Jesus' parable about the good Samaritan. So they're walking down the road, and the text says they have to go through Samaria, which is true if you want to, but you could skirt around it, as I discovered. But it's Jesus who says that. He wants to make a point. They've been walking a long way. It's hot. His friends leave him at a well to get some water, and they go into town to buy some food. And here comes a woman with a bucket to get water. Oops. Two big problems. She's a Samaritan, and she's a woman alone. Doesn't happen in that culture. Still rarely happens. It's a remarkable story. What happens next is the longest conversation that Jesus has with anybody in the Gospels. You can count the words later on if you want. It's the longest one. Simple request, he asks for a drink. But he's crossing two huge boundaries, the boundary of gender and the boundary of race. Talking with a woman, who knows what that'll lead to. Just seeing if you're listening. And talking with a Samaritan. You don't do that. She's astonished. They talk a little more about which mountain do you worship God at. And the disciples returned with food, and they are flabbergasted. What in the world is happening? We leave him alone for an hour, and he starts talking with a woman and a Samaritan woman. Now, the best part of the story comes next. She drops her water jar, runs off into the village, and tells her friends about Jesus. Who accepts her with her questionable marital history, all the sexual morality issues that come along with it. A man who ignores who she is, a woman and a Samaritan, and engages her in a respectful conversation. So she says he can't be the Messiah, can he? And here's the kicker. She, this Samaritan woman, is actually the first Christian evangelist. Get that. Many Samaritans from the city believed in him because of the woman's testimony, the gospel records. And then they, I don't know if you remember the last couple of verses, they stay along for 2 days. They're swapping stories, singing songs, watching the kids play, preparing food, sleeping under one roof together. It's impossible almost for us today to get the dramatic transformation that was. Long-held traditions just set aside by Jesus. That's why Jesus matters. Nobody ever talked like Jesus. Nobody ever did the things that he did. Nobody ever. So radical, we really can't grasp it. The history of the story, if you got my e-news, 500 years ago, John Calvin, like most men, was fascinated by the woman's marital history. He blames her for all of the divorces, 1,500 years after the fact. One of my favorite Southern preachers, a guy named the late Fred Craddock, says countless evangelists have had a field day with this story, created a picture of painted lips, heavy mascara, short skirt, failing to seduce Jesus. Now, the text doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. We don't know a thing about her history, although obviously it was tragic. What's truly stunning is what Jesus doesn't say. It's almost if he doesn't care about the 5 husbands or the man she's currently with. He focuses on her, a child of God, worthy of his attention, worthy of a respectful theological conversation. And to her, his acceptance, his unconditional love, it's like a glass of living water. Jesus crosses convention, crosses religious boundaries, crosses cultural boundaries, crosses ethnic boundaries. There's a word there for us about civility. I don't know if anybody's watching the American election thing. I'll just leave it there. There's a great story about a distinguished African American scholar and theologian named Howard Thurman. Thurman grew up in the era where the earlier story I told. He tells about taking his wife and 2 daughters on a trip through the South, even though they were Northerners. At a rest stop, his daughter saw the playground, but she didn't see or couldn't read the sign that said whites only. When he said that they couldn't play on the swings, the girl started to cry. So he did what his mother did for him. He gathered them in his arms. Said, listen, you girls are really somebody. You are so important. You are so valuable to God that it takes the governor and all of the state police to keep you little girls from those swings. That's what Jesus did for a Samaritan woman one day long ago. And that's the heart of the Christian message. 20 years later, 20 centuries later, it's still the same. No matter who you are, whether you're self-confident or whether you're not sure you're acceptable to others or to God or to yourself, whatever your upbringing, your education or your lack of it, your modest job you think's unimportant, your modest income, your monetary worth, whatever it is, the color of your skin, your age, your gender, your sexual orientation, no matter where you are on your spiritual journey, whether you're a regular church member, comfortable with your spirituality and beliefs, or not a member, or not sure what you believe, or searching, or you just came because you liked the band. Doesn't matter. No matter what you believe or find you cannot believe. No matter what you're doing with your life at this moment, raising some of these teenagers, going on a trip to Mexico, tearing your hair out, it just doesn't matter. Married or not, 5 husbands or 18, it just, no matter what. The radical, unlikely, and absolutely unique message is that in Jesus, God crosses all boundaries, all of them, all borders, and comes to us wherever we are, whatever we're doing, wherever we've been in the past, and wherever we're going. It's like those cream and jelly sandwiches. Living water to all to know that you are loved and accepted by God in Jesus. All praise to Him. Amen. Let's pray. Holy God, we thank you for what your Son, Jesus, did on a sun-kissed afternoon in Samaria to a woman who didn't know who she was, but who does now. And I pray for each of us, we will have that same awareness in our hearts of your unconditional love. Amen.